A country born of free slaves became the beacon of hope to many African nations. The West African nation was the forerunner of democracy and peaceful coexistence until it ran into a state of anarchy. The coup of April 12, 1980 ended 133 years of Americo-Liberian or free slaves rule. Many scholars, journalists, and the Western media have heard and written about Liberia with 14 years of civil war and devastating effects shadowing other significant stories. However, this is the Liberian story, as told by Liberians themselves on the historical foundations of Liberia and how the nation-state has ensured its existence in the Committee of Nations. It promises to unrival Liberia's unique political, diplomatic, cultural, social, and economic significance. Former Liberia Information Minister and current lecturer at the Foreign Service Institute, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Liberia, Reverend J. Emmanuel Zebuya, provides details on the structure and composition of the state considering historical and religious perspectives.
The place we now call Liberia was a part of the vast continent of Africa long before slavery. That is, people were living here in peace, but then when people in the Americas and Europe saw it necessary to get other people to do their hard work, they came to Africa looking for people, and these people were slaves. Then when people in especially the West, the Americas, saw that it was profitable to have these blacks from Africa to work for them because the Native Americans or the Indians in America were not so strong as the Africans. They couldn't work in the hot sun during the summer. The diseases that the Europeans brought from Europe to America were killing up the Native Americans, but the Africans were resistant to these diseases. So the African became the group of people that were most desirable for slavery. And so they took them from this continent. First, they bought them from chiefs and elders who were willing to sell people for money and for goods like tobacco, like guns and ammunitions and liquor and all of that. And then later, when it became very profitable, the slave owners designed a program by which they raided African villages and took people away. So it got changed from the slave trade to the slave raid. When they came, they didn't deal with the chiefs and kings and elders anymore. Everybody, including the chiefs, the kings, and the elders, became slaves because they brought white masters that raided these villages and took people away by the thousands to go and be slaves on plantations abroad. They didn't take them straight to the Americas. They passed them through what they call the Middle Passage. That is, they took them down south to the Caribbean island before they took them to the United States. And the reason for that was among the people who went were various ethnic groups having various physical structures. And these slave owners wanted strong, hard-working men and women. So they examined these people. They took the husky-looking people, the tall persons, men and women, and took them to the Caribbean island and had hostels there for them where they would have sex and produce children because they wanted the product of that union to be very strong and be able to work on farms and other places. So they forced these people to become partners and they produced children. And these children were taken away from them. It's like having the chicken having eggs and you take the egg to the supermarket and sell. And the chicken has nothing to do with the eggs. So this Middle Passage was a place where they got to separate the children from their mothers and fathers. And so from the Caribbean island, people were shipped to the mainland to go and work. And by that time, the laws in the United States said that blacks and whites were not equal. In fact, blacks were not fully human. They were subhuman, less than human beings. And so they had to do something about what became the black problem in the United States. And that which they had to do was to see about how they could subdue and then separate blacks from whites. And so they had this meeting in Washington, D.C. in December 1816. In Washington, D.C. And it was in this meeting, December 1816, that they established the American Colonization Society for the purpose of bringing black people back to Africa. When they got the ships and everything ready to bring people, they found out that there were some blacks who said they were not leaving the United States. That they had lived there, their ancestors went there, and it were almost 400 years. And the United States had subjected them to all kinds of treatments. And so they were not willing to come back to Africa because their blood, sweat, and tears were mingled with development in America, and so they have a right to stay there and enjoy America. Martin Luther King Jr. has a book that he wrote before he died called Why We Can't Wait. In that book, he criticized those who came to Liberia. He said those blacks who came to Liberia should not have come to Liberia. They should have stayed in the United States and demanded the right to be there because they helped to build that country. So when the American government, during the time of James Monroe, was confronted with that, they turned to the social scientists of that day to find out how they could get the black people to voluntarily come to Africa. And they were told that these black folks love religion. And if you tell them you are sending them back to Africa to Christianize and civilize their own people, they will be happy to come. And the government at that time got a pastor in New Jersey, Pastor Robert Finley of the Presbyterian Church in New Jersey, who was also of Princeton University, to arrange to recruit people to be brought back to Africa. Pastor Finley from the Presbyterian Church started the program, and then he died shortly after. And the Baptist people took on this project with a zeal. And it was the Baptists that landed the first group of immigrants on Providence Island, January 7, 1822. You had three waves of people that organized this country. The Baptists were the first wave of Christians that came. They were followed by the Methodists. And then last came the Presbyterians, who were the first, they became the last. So you had three groups of people coming. When they arrived here, they met two. They met the African traditional religion and they met Islam. African traditional religion doesn't have a date for arrival here. It's difficult to trace the date. Islam came here about the 15th, 16th century. And they were here. Christianity arrived in the 18th century. When the Christians arrived on Providence Island, Islam was already in Liberia. I must tell you, because Christianity organized Liberia, the people who organized Liberia were Christians. When the Christians arrived in Liberia, the people who were here, the Muslims and the other people who were practicing the African traditional religion, were not conversant with New World thinking. They were not speaking English very well, except enough to transact business with traders that came here. They knew nothing about law or anything about politics as it is practiced in the West. They had their own situation here. They had their own kingdoms here, ruled by kings. We in Liberia should recognize one thing, and that is that God put us together. God put this country together. When Christianity arrived, January 7, 1822, they could have been wiped out. The people who came here, the 8 immigrants, could have been wiped out in 10 minutes. because they met kingdoms established here. The Republic of Liberia was founded on Christian principles. The people who organized this country were Christians, and they organized it. When the Republic of Liberia became independent in 1847, as I told you, Ibrahim Sise had his kingdom. Saboso had his kingdom. They were not part of Liberia. So the Declaration of Independence does not contain one name that is indigenous. It contains the names of people who came here, who were basically Christians. Everything they put in the document was about Christianity. So it was founded on Christian principles. It does not mean that it became a Christian state. Mr. Joseph Jenkins Roberts, in his first inaugural address, said that we have come here to establish an African Christian state. He said it, but it was never declared an African Christian state. It remained neutral to all religion, and in fact it is stated in there that no religion will be preferred over the other. Even though the people who did this were Christians, they allow for all people to have equal rights. Liberia is God's own chosen country. There are only two countries in the whole world that I have studied and seen clearly in the providence of God: Liberia and Israel. Liberia and Israel have the same history. Israel came out of slavery to become a nation. Liberia came out of slavery to become a nation. Israel disobeyed God. God spread the people of Israel all over the world, saying you'll be slaves to everybody, they will misuse you. And it happened. They cried unto God. God rescued them. Then they did it again. God put them there. When it got to the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, God commanded that the book should be closed. I'm tired of these people. They are stiff-necked people. Let them go suffer. And for 400 years, there was no prophecy in Israel. There was no king. There were no judges. The people of Israel were spread all over the world under the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, everybody. They cried unto God again. And God said in Isaiah, I've heard the cry of my people. I've heard their groaning. I will gather them from the four corners of the earth, and they will become a nation, and no nation will be able to stand before them. It is in the Bible. And everybody everywhere that didn't like Israel was saying, what is that? Let's see it happen. And for a long time, it never happened. Until 1948. 1948 May, Israel applied to the United Nations to become a nation, to be recognized. They had a debate. They cast the vote. The vote was tied. Israel was hanging in the balance. But God had already prepared the way. In Liberia, God had planted a former pastor to be president of Liberia, William V.S. Tubman, a former local preacher in the Methodist Church. At the United Nations in New York, God had already planted a pastor to be our ambassador there, the Reverend Dr. T. DeSumo Johnson of the Baptist Church. So Tubman here, Johnson in New York. Johnson sends a radiogram to Tubman. Israel hangs in the balance. What shall I do? Tubman did not forget his Bible training and his training as a minister. Tubman remembered that God said, if you curse Israel, I will curse you. If you bless Israel, I will bless you. Tubman ordered his ambassador to the United Nations to cast the vote for Israel. When they went to the re-voting, Liberia cast the 33rd vote in May 1948. that created the state of Israel. So Liberia was that nation prophesied by God that I will gather my people from around the world and I would establish them as a state. Liberia became the instrument of God's prophecy to bring about the state of Israel. That's why from time immemorial, since 1948, Israel and Liberia have been friends, close friends.
With no standing army, Liberia has been able to position itself in Africa and the world. The secret behind that success is Liberia's state art of diplomacy. Ambassador Robert L. Lomia II, Ambassador at Large, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Liberia, will drill you through.
In the absence of a standing army, which we didn't have, in the absence of armed police, which we didn't have, the only weapon we had at our disposal to maintain our sovereignty and independence was diplomacy. Our skill in dealing with European leaders, the monarchs, in recognizing and treating us with empathy was our greatest asset. So diplomacy saved Liberia, it safeguarded Liberia, and it is still the master tool that we have today at our disposal. Let no man deceive you. We fought some civil war here, yes, it happened to every country, but we have not lost that honor of being the mastermind of diplomacy in Africa. From 1847 to 1850, we declared our independence in 1847, and the first country to acknowledge that they would do business with us was Great Britain, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, followed by France, then Belgium, then Germany, but they didn't call it Germany at the time, it was Prussia. Okay, then Holland. Okay, then gradually countries start to, they will say, okay, we acknowledge that you exist, but in a couple of years we acknowledge your recognition, you will recognize your independence as a state. So then that's how Liberia went on. So immediately after independence, President Joseph Jenkins Robert did not stay in the country. He spent nine months of the 2 years term in Europe, lobbying with European powers, to recognize Liberia. That was the most important thing. It was a priority for the independence of Liberia to be recognized by these powers. So once Great Britain, United Kingdom, recognized Liberia, France followed, then other countries were weary, to put any challenge to the sovereignty of Liberia, so they all stopped. After independence, the government of the United States didn't want to recognize the Republic of Liberia because by doing so, the possibility of having a Liberian envoy in Washington was high, and who would have been that envoy? A black man, right? So if you have a black man as envoy of a sovereign state, you are speaking volume to other blacks in the United States and other deprived whites in the United States. So probably they would have moved in drove to the new republic and posed a challenge, a threat to the United States. So they kept this question of recognizing the independence of Liberia, at bay, because they didn't want to cause any stir internally. We declared independence in 1847. The Berlin Conference took place in 1884. That means you have been existing as a sovereign country until the Berlin Conference came that authorized the European powers to divide up Africa among themselves. So any of those powers who are taking us. The British government had given J.J. Robert money to buy land, the Galena territory and other places, and later on they came and seized it. All right, we thank God that they did not seize the entire Republic of Liberia. The French in the east and the northern part of Liberia were also ceding our territory and adding it to their colony of Cote d'Ivoire and Guinea. All right. So they chop up pieces of Liberia to the north, to the east, and to the west. So whatever little remains of us is what we have. From 270,000 square miles, we just remain a little of 39,000, or sometimes we say 43,000 square miles. All right, but it was bigger than this. So we are lucky. We may not have had good trade deal, yes, but we were able to be allowed to exist among those powers. We need to remember also that in our relationship with other countries, it's not just friendship. It's not just friendship. You are not relating to any country because you want to be friendly. In international relations, there's a popular slogan there. There's no permanent friend, but there's always what? Permanent interest. So you look after your interests. What is Liberia going to benefit by being friendly with China? What is Liberia going to benefit by being friendly with Iran or Iraq or Israel? Okay? If the benefit you derive is higher, then of course, if another country try to interfere, you can break tie with that country and go to where your side is better, right? Yes. So that is what we are. You know, first thing, we are non-aligned, which means we don't take side. You know, we are not on any side of the polar war, whether west or east. We are by ourselves, independent, to decide what is good for our country in terms of what we want as our national interest.
On this piece, Dr. Augustine Conner, Director General, Foreign Service Institute, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Liberia, will take you on the ride about the acquisition of land by the early settlers and how leadership and governance was shared and practiced by indigenous Liberians and the early settlers.
The evidence that we have seen is very scanty. I will characterize at that beginning that the way land was acquired by those who were coming, the settlers, it was based upon what is known, and I characterize it as squatter rights. The squatter rights being the fact that here these settlers are coming, and because they are coming in, they need a place to stay. This is what is very important. Land at that time was not owned by an individual. Land was owned by the community. And so no individual had the right to sell, you know. And so the claim that people sold land, I have read documents where it was shown that, particularly in 1822, that Eli, Aries, and Stockton were able to purchase land from one King Peter. Yeah, King Peter did not own land. And so I looked at it from that perspective, and I've been trying to look for deeds. I've gone to the archive to say, because they say there are deeds that are available. But at that time, the first land that were purchased, and this is what I want to make very clear, that the models that these settlers use when they begin to expand onto the coast and into the areas where they settled, where the settlement became, they followed American models. I've always made that argument. The purchasing of land that not for purchase, the acquiring of the friendship of deeds, they turn those friendship of deeds to ownership, you know. So I'm looking at it that it was more of a core system that was being put forth. So in the initial stages, I have always argued that these lands were given out because here our brothers and sisters are coming back. We can give them some place where they can settle. And so as a result, they were able to be given squatter rights. After the purchase of the land, because that was the Ducal contract of 1822, that Ducal contract saw the negotiation of the land, where the Day people, the Gola and the others were able to negotiate and to give land. And then when we begin to see the expansion of the settlers into those various areas, those areas that they expanded, the leadership there the indigenous people played a very little role because they had their own form of leadership. And this form of leadership that was coming in was very different. And so in terms of leadership, I have always argued that they were not given, because you have to go back and look at who were in control. They were not in control. So leadership-wise, they play a very minimal role. 1822, when you saw the kind of formation that was put in place in terms of leadership, it was plainly a settler kind of leadership. All right. And that kind of leadership was governed by those who came. And so that citizenship and other things, because indigenous people were not citizens at this time. All right. And then they moved into those places, and then they created a commonwealth. Because you need to know that the commonwealth, because the settlers, they move into places like Carisburg, these are the settlements. And then later on, because Judy Ashman was the one that was leading all these negotiations to make sure that they established those settlements. But then they later on realized we need to consolidate this settlement. And that's where the Commonwealth comes in. The Commonwealth is a consolidation of those settlements. And here we saw a different kind of leadership. So now they were given a different kind of title, governor. So those who be in leadership were governors. But the indigenous people were allowed to control their own people through a system that we know in the other places, indirect rule. Yeah, so that they will be a part and parcel. In fact, there is something that I wrote on the hot tax war. As a form of, the indigenous people were saying, no, we will be willing to pay hot tax because that give us legitimacy to be a part of this leadership. So hot tax was done for them to be a part of the leadership. So the Commonwealth is governorship. Then in July 26, when the independence came of July 26, we saw a new kind of leadership because now we're moving from governor to president. And so here we see that we're moving from a settler then to Commonwealth, governorship, and now is to a presidency. So as a result of that, we're able to have a new kind of leadership that is now very, very involved with indigenous people, because now the first president realized the first thing we need to do is to begin to authenticate in terms of land ownership. And so the negotiations that took place from 1847, you can find those documents. But before 1847, you can't find those documents. And so that's how leadership were being put in place, both for the indigenous people and for those settlers that came. And that's why we have the formation of the nation under the first president, J.J. Roberts.
This documentary opens to the world Liberia's lost and forgotten story. This is about Liberians telling Liberia's story.
This has been an archival research project on Liberian history conducted by the Liberian Research and Development Networks, wherein Liberians themselves explain aspects of the Liberian history, which is quite important about people explaining about themselves.